Welcome to True Crime Threads, where we unravel the darkest secrets hidden behind closed doors. Today's story, a forbidden affair, a shattered family, and a murder that shocked a quiet town to its core. In the quiet town of Willow Creek, the Delaney family was the envy of the neighborhood. From the outside, they appeared to have it all: a beautiful home, financial stability, and a seemingly unshakable bond. Adhara Delaney, a striking woman in her early 40s, was the epitome of grace and charm. She was the kind of person who could light up a room with her presence, effortlessly drawing people in with her warm smile and magnetic personality. Her husband, Julian, was a successful businessman, well respected in the community for his sharp mind and ambitious drive. Together, they had built a life that many could only dream of. Their 18-year-old son, Joseph, was the pride of the family, a star athlete with a bright future ahead of him. He was the golden boy of Willow Creek High, admired by his peers and teachers alike for his talent and determination. But behind the polished facade of the Delaney family, cracks were beginning to show. Julian's demanding career often kept him away from home for days, sometimes even weeks at a time. His frequent absences left Adhara feeling isolated and neglected. She had once been the center of Julian's world, but over the years their marriage had grown cold and distant. The spark that had once defined their relationship had faded, replaced by a quiet resentment that neither of them dared to address. Adhara found herself yearning for the attention and affection she no longer received from her husband. It was during this time of loneliness that Adhara began to grow closer to Joseph. At first, their bond was innocent, a mother and son spending time together, sharing hobbies and interests. Adhara had always been a devoted stepmother, and Joseph had grown up under her care, seeing her as a maternal figure. But as the months passed, their relationship began to shift in ways that neither of them could fully comprehend. Adhara found herself drawn to Joseph in a way that defied explanation. He was young, vibrant, and full of life, everything Julian was not. For Joseph, Adhara represented a source of comfort and understanding that he couldn't find elsewhere. The lines between mother and son blurred, and what began as innocent bonding soon spiraled into something far more dangerous. Their affair started slowly, almost imperceptibly. A lingering touch here, a shared glance there, small moments that grew into something neither of them could ignore. Adhara knew it was wrong, but the thrill of secrecy and the attention she craved clouded her judgment. Joseph, too, was conflicted. He admired Adhara, but he also felt a growing sense of guilt and confusion. Yet, despite their inner turmoil, they continued down a path that would ultimately lead to disaster. For months, they managed to keep their relationship hidden. In a small town like Willow Creek, where everyone knew everyone else's business, this was no small feat. They became experts at deception, carefully crafting a facade of normalcy to avoid suspicion. Adhara played the role of the doting wife and mother, while Joseph maintained his image as the perfect son and athlete. But secrets have a way of festering, and the weight of their lies began to take its toll. Adhara grew increasingly paranoid, convinced that someone would discover the truth. Joseph, too, felt the strain, his once confident demeanor giving way to anxiety and restlessness. Unbeknownst to them, the cracks in their carefully constructed world were beginning to widen. Julian's frequent absences, once a source of frustration for Adhara, now served as the perfect cover for their affair. But as the days turned into weeks, the tension in the Delaney household became palpable. Julian, though oblivious to the truth, sensed that something was off. He noticed the way Adhara and Joseph seemed to share secrets, the way they avoided his gaze when he returned home. He dismissed it as teenage rebellion and marital strain, but deep down, a seed of doubt had been planted. The Delaney family was teetering on the edge of a precipice, and it would only take one misstep to send them tumbling into the abyss. What had started as a desperate attempt to fill a void had spiraled into a dangerous game of deception and desire. Little did they know, their actions would set off a chain of events that would shatter their lives forever. The perfect family facade was about to crumble, revealing the darkness that lay beneath. As the affair between Adhara and Joseph continued, the once idyllic town of Willow Creek began to buzz with whispers. Small towns have a way of sensing when something is amiss, and the Delaney family was no exception. Neighbors and friends started to notice subtle changes in the dynamics of the household. Adhara and Joseph, who had always been close, now seemed inseparable in a way that raised eyebrows. They were often seen together at odd hours, early mornings at the local cafe, late-night drives, and long walks through the woods. While some dismissed it as a mother and son bonding, others couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Joseph's behavior, in particular, began to draw attention. Once a confident and outgoing teenager, he became increasingly withdrawn and moody. His grades, which had always been stellar, started to slip. Teachers noted his lack of focus in class, and his coaches were baffled by his sudden decline in performance on the field. The star athlete who had once led his team to victory now seemed disinterested and distracted. His friends, too, noticed the change. Joseph, who had always been the life of the party, now avoided social gatherings altogether. When pressed, he would brush off their concerns with vague excuses about being tired or stressed. Julian, still largely unaware of the truth, grew increasingly frustrated with Joseph's behavior. He saw his stepson's struggles as a lack of discipline and blamed Adhara for being too lenient. Their arguments became more frequent and heated, with Julian accusing Adhara of coddling Joseph and failing to prepare him for the real world. Adhara, on the other hand, defended Joseph fiercely, her protectiveness only fueling Julian's suspicions. The tension in the household was palpable, and the once harmonious family dynamic was unraveling at an alarming rate. Meanwhile, Adhara's paranoia began to grow. She was acutely aware of the rumors swirling around town and the way people looked at her and Joseph when they were together. She started to second-guess every interaction, every glance, every word. The weight of their secret was becoming unbearable, and she began to pressure Joseph to be more careful. She warned him of the consequences if their affair were ever discovered, the scandal, the shame, the irreversible damage to their family. Joseph, already struggling with guilt and confusion, found himself trapped in a web of lies and manipulation. The strain of their secret began to take a toll on both of them. Adhara, once the picture of composure, became increasingly erratic. She would swing between moments of intense affection toward Joseph and sudden bursts of anger and frustration. Joseph, caught in the middle of Adhara's emotional turmoil and Julian's growing suspicions, felt like he was losing control. He began to question the choices he had made, but the fear of exposure kept him tethered to Adhara. As the weeks turned into months, the cracks in their carefully constructed facade grew wider. Julian, though still in the dark about the affair, began to piece together fragments of the truth. He noticed the way Adhara and Joseph seemed to share secrets, the way they avoided his gaze when he returned home. He started to question the late-night outings and the whispered conversations that stopped the moment he entered the room. His once unshakable trust in his wife and stepson began to waver, and he found himself consumed by a gnawing sense of unease. The tension in the Delaney household reached a boiling point one evening when Julian returned home unexpectedly from a business trip. He had intended to surprise his family, but what he walked in on was a shock he could never have anticipated. The truth, long buried beneath layers of lies and deception, was finally laid bare. In that moment, the fragile world the Delaneys had built came crashing down, setting the stage for a tragedy that would forever change their lives. The whispers in Willow Creek were no longer just rumors. They were the harbingers of a storm that was about to engulf the Delaney family. The affair between Adhara and Joseph, once hidden in the shadows, was about to be exposed, and the consequences would be devastating. The perfect family facade was crumbling, and there was no going back. The night Julian returned home unexpectedly was supposed to be like any other. Adhara and Joseph had grown accustomed to his absences, using them as opportunities to spend time together without fear of being caught. But on this particular evening, their carefully constructed world came crashing down in an instant. Julian, tired from his trip and eager to see his family, arrived home earlier than planned. He let himself in quietly, not wanting to disturb anyone, but what he found in the living room stopped him in his tracks. Adhara and Joseph were seated close together on the couch, their heads bent in conversation. At first, Julian thought nothing of it, until he noticed the way they were looking at each other. There was an intimacy in their gaze, a familiarity that went beyond the bounds of a mother-son relationship. The air in the room seemed to shift as Julian's presence registered, and Adhara and Joseph quickly pulled apart, their faces flushed with guilt. Julian's mind raced as he tried to make sense of what he had just witnessed. The pieces began to fall into place. The whispered conversations, the late-night outings, the way Joseph had been avoiding him. A wave of anger and betrayal washed over him, and he demanded an explanation. What followed was a confrontation that would change everything. Julian's voice echoed through the house as he unleashed years of pent-up frustration and suspicion. He accused Adhara of betraying him, of destroying their family with her selfishness. Joseph, caught in the crossfire, tried to defend Adhara, but his words only fueled Julian's rage. The argument escalated, with Julian threatening to expose their affair to the entire town. He vowed to ruin Adhara's reputation and ensure that Joseph would never escape the shadow of their scandal. The once quiet household was filled with shouting and chaos, the walls seeming to close in on everyone involved. As the night wore on, the tension reached a breaking point. Adhara, desperate to protect herself and Joseph, began to formulate a plan. She knew that Julian's threats were not empty. He had the power to destroy their lives, and she couldn't let that happen. Joseph, overwhelmed by guilt and fear, looked to Adhara for guidance. Together, they made a decision that would seal their fate. Late that night, while Julian slept, they carried out a plan to silence him forever. Using a combination of sleeping pills and alcohol, they staged his death to look like an accidental overdose. It was a cold and calculated act, born out of desperation and fear. The next morning, Adhara called 911, her voice trembling as she reported that she had found Julian unresponsive in bed. When the paramedics arrived, they found Julian's lifeless body, the scene carefully arranged to support Adhara's story. She played the role of the grieving widow perfectly, her tears and distress convincing everyone at first glance. Joseph, too, played his part, his shock and sorrow appearing genuine. The police initially treated the case as a tragic accident, but as they began to investigate, inconsistencies started to emerge. Julian's colleagues were quick to point out that he had no history of substance abuse, and his health records showed no signs of the issues Adhara had cited. The autopsy revealed traces of a sedative in Julian's system, raising questions about how it had gotten there. Detectives began to dig deeper, interviewing neighbors and friends who had noticed the strange behavior in the Delaney household. The rumors about Adhara and Joseph, once dismissed as idle gossip, now took on a more sinister tone. As the investigation progressed, Adhara and Joseph found themselves under increasing scrutiny. Adhara tried to maintain her composure, but her nervous demeanor and erratic behavior only raised more red flags. Joseph, unable to cope with the guilt, began to withdraw even further, his once bright future now overshadowed by the weight of their secret. The police uncovered text messages and phone records that pointed to a hidden relationship between Adhara and Joseph, and the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. The Delaney family, once the envy of Willow Creek, was now at the center of a scandal that would rock the town to its core. The affair between Adhara and Joseph, once hidden in the shadows, was about to be exposed, and the consequences would be devastating. The perfect family facade had crumbled, revealing a web of lies, betrayal, and murder. The storm that had been brewing for months was finally here, and there was no escaping its wrath. The investigation into Julian's death began with a sense of routine. The police had initially treated it as a tragic accident, a case of a man succumbing to the pressures of his high-stress lifestyle. But as they delved deeper, the cracks in Adhara's story started to show. The autopsy report was the first red flag. Traces of a powerful sedative were found in Julian's system, a substance he had no known reason to take. Detectives began to question how the drug had entered his body, and their suspicions quickly turned to Adhara and Joseph. Adhara, who had once been the picture of a grieving widow, began to unravel under the pressure of the investigation. Her carefully rehearsed story started to fall apart as detectives probed deeper into her alibi and the timeline of events. She claimed that Julian had been stressed and had taken the sedative to help him sleep, but her explanation didn't hold up under scrutiny. Julian's colleagues and friends were quick to point out that he had never shown any signs of substance abuse or dependency. In fact, he had always been vocal about his disdain for medication, preferring to manage stress through exercise and discipline. Joseph, too, began to crack under the weight of the investigation. His once confident demeanor had already been eroded by guilt and fear, and now the constant questioning from detectives pushed him to the brink. He avoided eye contact, stumbled over his words, and seemed to be hiding something. Detectives noticed the way he and Adhara exchanged nervous glances during interviews, as if silently communicating their shared secret. The more they pressed, the more evident it became that Joseph was hiding something significant. The police turned their attention to the Delaney household, searching for any evidence that could shed light on Julian's death. They combed through phone records, text messages, and emails, uncovering a trail of communication between Adhara and Joseph that raised serious questions. The messages were often cryptic, filled with coded language and references to keeping things quiet and sticking to the plan. Detectives also discovered that Adhara had purchased the sedative found in Julian's system just days before his death, using a fake name to avoid detection. The pieces of the puzzle were coming together, and the picture they formed was damning. As the evidence mounted, Adhara and Joseph found themselves increasingly isolated. Friends and neighbors, once supportive, began to distance themselves, wary of being associated with the growing scandal. The whispers in Willow Creek grew louder, and the Delaney family became the subject of hushed conversations and speculative gossip. Adhara tried to maintain her composure, but her erratic behavior only fueled the rumors. She was seen pacing outside her home at odd hours, her once impeccable appearance now disheveled and unkempt. Joseph, meanwhile, became a ghost of his former self, skipping school and avoiding contact with anyone outside his immediate family. The turning point in the investigation came when Joseph, overwhelmed by guilt and fear, finally broke down. During an intense interrogation, he confessed to his role in Julian's death. His voice trembled as he recounted the events of that fateful night, describing how Adhara had pressured him into helping her stage Julian's death. He revealed the details of their affair, the confrontation with Julian, and the desperate plan they had concocted to silence him forever. Joseph's confession was a bombshell, and it sent shockwaves through the investigation. With Joseph's statement, the police moved quickly to arrest Adhara. She was taken into custody, her carefully constructed facade crumbling as she was led away in handcuffs. The town of Willow Creek was left reeling, struggling to reconcile the image of the perfect Delaney family with the dark truth that had been revealed. The investigation, once focused on a tragic accident, had uncovered a web of lies, betrayal, and murder. As the case moved toward trial, the details of Adhara and Joseph's relationship became public, painting a picture of manipulation and desperation. Adhara was portrayed as a calculating and manipulative woman who had preyed on her stepson's vulnerability, while Joseph was seen as a young man caught in a web of deceit. The Delaney family, once the envy of Willow Creek, was now a cautionary tale, a stark reminder of how quickly lives can unravel when secrets and forbidden desires take hold. The storm that had been brewing for months had finally broken, and its aftermath would leave the town forever changed. The trial of Adhara Delaney was the most sensational event Willow Creek had ever seen. The courtroom was packed every day, with townspeople and reporters alike eager to catch a glimpse of the woman at the center of the scandal. Adhara, once the epitome of grace and charm, now sat stoically at the defense table, her face a mask of composure. But beneath the surface, she was a woman on the edge, her carefully constructed world crumbling around her. The prosecution painted a damning picture of her as a manipulative and calculating figure who had orchestrated Julian's murder to protect her secret affair with Joseph. Joseph, now a key witness for the prosecution, took the stand with visible reluctance. His once bright future had been shattered, and the weight of his guilt was evident in every word he spoke. He recounted the details of the affair, the confrontation with Julian and the chilling plan to stage his death. His testimony was raw and emotional, and it left the courtroom in stunned silence. He described how Adhara had pressured him into compliance, using fear and manipulation to ensure his cooperation. Joseph's confession was a turning point in the trial, and it left little room for doubt about Adhara's guilt. The defense, however, fought back fiercely. They argued that Joseph was equally culpable, portraying him as a willing participant who had acted out of his own desires rather than coercion. They painted Adhara as a victim of circumstance, a woman who had been driven to desperation by a loveless marriage and a stepson who had taken advantage of her vulnerability. But the evidence against Adhara was overwhelming. The text messages, the purchase of the sedative, and Joseph's testimony all pointed to her as the mastermind behind Julian's murder. The jury deliberated for days, but in the end the verdict was clear. Adhara was guilty of first-degree murder. The sentencing was a somber affair. Adhara showed no emotion as the judge handed down her sentence, life in prison without the possibility of parole. The courtroom erupted in murmurs, but Adhara remained eerily calm, as if she had already accepted her fate. Joseph, who had pleaded guilty to a lesser charge in exchange for his cooperation, received a reduced sentence of 15 years. His youth and his role as a witness had spared him the harshest punishment, but his life would never be the same. The once promising athlete was now a convicted felon, his future forever tainted by the choices he had made. In the aftermath of the trial, the town of Willow Creek struggled to come to terms with what had happened. The Delaney family, once the embodiment of success and happiness, was now synonymous with scandal and tragedy. Neighbors and friends who had once admired Adhara and Joseph now spoke of them in hushed tones, their names forever linked to betrayal and murder. Julian's death had left a void in the community, and the revelation of the affair had shattered any remaining illusions about the perfect family. For Adhara, life in prison was a stark contrast to the privileged existence she had once known. Stripped of her freedom and her identity, she became a shadow of her former self. She spent her days reflecting on the choices that had led her to this point, haunted by the memory of Julian and the life they could have had. Joseph, too, grappled with his guilt, his time behind bars a constant reminder of the consequences of his actions. The bond that had once drawn them together now seemed like a distant and painful memory, a reminder of how far they had fallen. The case of the Delaney family became a cautionary tale, a story of how secrets and forbidden desires can lead to unimaginable consequences. It was a reminder that even the most perfect facades can hide the darkest truths. For the people of Willow Creek, the scandal was a wake-up call, a stark reminder that no one is immune to the temptations and tragedies that can tear lives apart. The affair between Adhara and Joseph didn't just end in betrayal, it ended in murder, leaving a legacy of pain and loss that would linger for years to come.